Thank you for tuning in again to Trail of Family Tales. This segment, we will be talking about and getting to know Mrs. Betty Hill's, my great-grandmother's children, who were Will Anna, Reuben, my grandfather, Zelma, and William Jr. Aunt Anna was born in the late 19 teens, I believe, or right around 1920. She was the eldest of my great-grandparents. Aunt Anna was born with special needs. Okay, she could not hear and she could not talk. Virginia has quite a few, they had a couple of schools for children who were deaf and unable to talk, deaf and blind. One of the schools is still in existence in the Shenandoah Valley. So when I would go up to JMU, travel from Williamsburg to JMU to go to school for 4 years, I always saw the sign for the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind. Well, there was another school also for the deaf and blind, okay? But this school was for the colored children. Okay, this was for the Black children. Well, let me correct myself here. Colored did not only mean Black, colored also meant Native American or anybody who was non-white. So those children were able to go to a school in Newport News, Virginia. And it was almost vital to really go to a school like that, school for special needs, to be able to live a productive life as an adult. So the story was shared that Aunt Zine orchestrated and organized and took the lead in enrolling Aunt Anna in this colored school for the deaf and blind. And the school opened, I'm going to put some more information in the video about the school, but that is the school that changed Aunt Anna's life. It helped her to be self-reliant. These are the qualities that Grandma Betty was trying to teach her children. She wanted them to be able to be self-reliant. And by Aunt Anna attending that school, she learned sign language. All of my grandfather and his siblings, all of them knew sign language. That's how they communicated with each other. And from what I heard, a story that my great uncle shared with me, Aunt Anna could get fiery. And so they all had their sibling type of interactions, but you know, she would knock on the table to get their attention. And she lived with Uncle Willie for a while before she passed away. She passed away prior to my grandfather passing. And she lived in New York City. She lived in Washington, D.C., Aunt Anna, my grandfather's sister. And she married a man who also was deaf and unable to speak. And they had 2 children. Their children they were hearing. They were able to hear and they were able to talk. And so I will always remember a story that my great uncle shared about Aunt Anna. When she went away to school, she met a friend. And that friend, her friend's name was Nancy. And they became longtime friends. Nancy was from Williamsburg, Virginia, ironically. And so Aunt Anna would go to Nancy's family's house in Williamsburg, and they just became like the best of friends. Aunt Anna wouldn't have had that if she had not attended that school. The decisions that Grandma Betty made to go to New York helped the family economically. And so she was able to offer Aunt Anna life. She was able to offer her a rebirth. Here's my grandfather. We called him Granddaddy Reuben. And that's my grandmother, his wife. In their younger years. What I'll say about my granddad is
he became the man of the house. Okay, when my great uncle would tell me the stories, because Grandma Amanda raised 4 daughters, she only had daughters, and when her husband Robert Johnson died in Delaware while he was away working, so this history in our family of people going away to earn a living, it has been something since emancipation that was just a part of what people had to do. So while he was in Delaware, I believe it was Wilmington, Delaware, is what I heard. He was working at the docks and he caught pneumonia, and that's how he passed away. So my grandfather never got to know that one of his grandfathers, but he did get to know his other grandfather, Grandpa Fitcher Hill, who lived in Richmond, Virginia. So we'll talk some about Grandpa Fitcher in this next video. But Granddaddy Reuben, because of the household being run by women, as he grew up quickly, is the story that was shared with me. And so he became the man of the house at an early age, and he was respected. Remember the time period that we're talking about here, okay? He was born in 1921. There was a lot of responsibility. They had a farm, so he was out milking the cows. They had cows. As a matter of fact, that is how Grandma Bettie passed away. She had had a stroke, and then they say some kind of way she went outside to milk a cow, and she shouldn't have been out there milking the cow. And next thing you know, the neighbor looks across the street and he sees her on the ground dead. How do I know that story to be fact? Well, I've heard it, but when my great uncle came down to King William County one time, he actually went to the house of one of the neighbors who lived across the street from them, blew the horn. And this is the country we're talking about, right? So he blew the horn. He said, just blow the horn. And I did. And the gentleman came outside. He was the florist for the county. When I blew the horn, he came out and then he started talking about Grandma Bettie. He said, they were some of the most strong-willed people and hard workers. And when he told the story he said, I will never forget that day when your mother, I saw her and found her laying on the ground outside. She had gone outside to milk the cow and she was gone by the time they got to her. And that she had had a second stroke. The first stroke didn't take her, they said, but it was the second stroke. And so Granddaddy, he stepped in to do a lot of those types of tasks. He worked hard in all of the agricultural work, the farming, the gardening of plants, the planting of plants, all of that it entails for that season. They had chickens and turkeys too. And so I will always remember the story. This is a funny story to me, but it was not funny the way my great uncle told it. But it was very funny in that my uncle told this story repeatedly. He said, it made me so mad when Reuben sold those turkeys. He sold over 100 turkeys to buy that sawmill. That he sold Grandma's turkeys, Grandma Mandy, her turkeys. And he said, Grandma just let Reuben do whatever he wanted to do because he was the oldest and they saw him as the man of the house and he could do anything he wanted. And my great uncle was a little distraught or bitter about it, I think. But of course, me, respecting my elders, I did not engage in that conversation. I couldn't take sides because he's talking about my granddad, but he's my great uncle and I love them both. And I really do honestly believe now when I look back and reflect on it, Uncle Willie just had a problem with the fact that was a big sell. And perhaps after Uncle Willie came back from the war, World War II, which we'll talk some about that, perhaps I think about it and I wonder if he planned to come back to the family farm, because he actually liked farming. He ended up in Philadelphia, which is a big contrast from the county, King William County, which is very rural. But he still talked about that until the end of his days. And so Granddaddy Reuben apparently sold those turkeys and bought a sawmill. My great uncle even shared a story of how it didn't take long to get to Richmond from King William County, because I guess people waited until low tide and they would just cross the river at low tide and they could get to Hanover County. Hanover was right across the river from King William County, so they would get to Hanover County, go on across, get to Henrico County, and then next thing you know, you're in Richmond. And my great grandfather lived on the eastern part of Henrico in Richmond, the part of Richmond that was closer to East Hanover. So it was, where they were coming from. It was not a long walk or transport from King William County to Richmond. My granddaddy Reuben was born in Richmond. He was born at the family homestead in Richmond. My great great grandfather Fitcher, they called him Grandpa Fitcher. He was my granddaddy Reuben's granddad. Owned a block of land in Richmond, and that land was where my granddad was born, and his siblings. They were all born in Richmond. And so Richmond was always, to me, almost like probably they saw it as a second home or maybe a dual home. My great uncle told me, he said, I always knew where to find father. So my granddad, he had a pretty good life, entrepreneur, farming. He decided was not for him. So he started a transportation business, secured a contract with the Naval Weapons Station, and he provided transportation. He did, like I said, he had the sawmill, so he worked on the land. He cut down trees, and actually he died on the job doing just that, cutting down trees. And he also had a trash business, so he collected people's trash, and so he did a lot of different types of jobs, but definitely a businessman. And let's talk about Aunt Zelma. Okay, so you see Aunt Zelma as a little girl. Her and Uncle Willie, they were pretty close, I think, as children. This is Aunt Zelma as an adult. I had a picture of her, another picture. I'm trying to think of it, but this is Aunt Zelma right here. Okay, so as an adult, she was the one who remained in agriculture, and she, as sharp as she is in this suit right here, she rolled up her sleeves. Her and her husband did poultry farming. So they had chickens, and they went to Richmond on a daily basis or throughout the week, and they sold those chicken eggs and took the chickens to market and sold them. And they actually had a really lucrative business. I mean, to the point that Aunt Zelma was known as a lady of wealth. She and her husband were very successful in their farming business. A few other interesting bits of information about Aunt Zelma. In her early years, she went away to Washington, D.C. during World War II to serve in the Women's Corps. So she did have public service to the United States during the war effort when the women were doing much of the clerical work. And I believe she did administrative or clerical typist type of office duties somewhere in one of the offices in D.C. to support the war effort while many of the men were on the front lines of the battlefield.
The other thing that's really kind of an interesting fact that I learned about Aunt Zelma is that she was a member of the gardening club in King William County. When I heard her say that she was a part of the gardening club or the garden club, I was like, oh, at first I thought that's a fancy name for a group of women who come together and do something else, not necessarily gardening. But I forgot for a moment that this is rural America. This is a rural area, which is different than a suburban area. And so they actually met about gardening tips, and they discussed plants and all of those types of things. She was an avid plant lover. I'll always remember her African violets. They were amazing. And the last thing that I really remember about Aunt Zelma, her house sat right across the street from her church. Beautiful brick church, well kept up. And I recall and remember Aunt Zelma, I think this was something she was very proud of. She served as the church clerk for a number of years, or a good number of years. And the other thing, I think she did substitute teach for King William County schools for a little bit. And she was civically engaged and involved in the county affairs. So she was a well-respected lady. So Uncle Willie, the baby. Okay, this is him. He went to World War II. And he was in the Navy as a baker. Okay, so you see, he took after Grandma Bettie and was a great cook. And I think pretty much all of them could cook. My grandfather, though, my grandmother is a great cook, so he didn't have to worry about cooking. And again, like I said, they made him the man of the house, so he didn't do that kind of stuff. He was out in the yard and dealing with the animals. So my great uncle, this is his military company. And he gave me that picture. He kept that picture for a long time. And that's Aunt Zelma and Uncle Willie. Uncle Willie had a little bandage on his leg. He was always into things. So yeah, Uncle Willie, he went into the Navy. He was deployed out to the Pacific. He trained in Chicago. One thing I did learn about this is something we'll talk about with the Hill family. But we did have some family connections in Chicago. And look at them. They look to love each other so much. Oh. So Uncle Willie, he comes back from World War II out on the ocean front, the Pacific. And he comes back across country on the train from, I think he came back from the Pacific Northwest on the train. He saw the whole country, and he would still tell stories about that experience. He came back, worked in New York, in Utica, New York, on the first computer printer, Univac. And he would tell stories about how that computer printer was a whole city block. It took up a whole city block because it was so large. So he did that. That was something he was really proud of. And after that job ended, he decided to go on down to Philadelphia. There were some of his uncles, the Hill uncles, were there, several of them. And so he knew it was family, and that was where he decided to make home. He did not want to come back south. And so he lived in Philadelphia for over 50 years. It was actually 60, closer to 60 years by the time he passed. He lived to be just about 90 years old. He was buried with honors. We definitely, he was buried in a beautiful military cemetery. I will always remember that. And the cemetery was very new. They had just opened. It was pretty far outside of Philadelphia. But that is what he wanted. He did not want to come back to Virginia. Our family church, my grandfather,
his church, he never joined the church where my grandmother attended in Williamsburg. He always kept his membership in King William County. And every year we would go back to King William County to Baptist Liberty Baptist Church. Baptist Liberty Baptist Church is they had some of the best homecomings ever. The best food, and everybody really did come back. I am so grateful in my lifetime that I can remember those homecomings. And even when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother and my dad and his siblings, they would go back every year. And that's the legacy of Amanda Harris Johnson, Grandma Mandy, and her daughters, Aunt Anna, Aunt Mary Frances, Grandma Bettie, Aunt Zine, Aunt Winnie Zine. That is their legacy.
Oh yeah!
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah!
The school that my granddad attended was the King William Training School, and the building still is there today. When my great uncle came down to Virginia for the last time before he passed, he actually wanted to drive by the school. He said, "Yeah, that's my school right there. The building is kept up well. It's a nice building." I want to share about the King William Training School. This is a historic site now that is managed by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. And it says this about the history of the King William Training School. It was built for African Americans with the assistance of the Julius Rosenwald Fund, which provided funds and a building plan. The complex, built in 1922 to 1923, consisted of a 4-room school, a home economics building, a shop building, privies, and a baseball field and other recreational areas. The school's origins traced to 1902, when Reverend Samuel B. Holmes persuaded the Pamunkey Baptist Association to construct a 2-room school on his property. That school eventually relocated and led to construction of the King William Training School, under the authority of the county, which had 2 other Rosenwald schools. To build a training school, the county's largest Rosenwald, the African American community, raised $7,900. The Rosenwald Fund contributed $1,100, and the county a mere $100. Initially, the school offered education for grades 1 through 9. In 1946, it added grades 10 through 12. And in 1962, it ceased to be used for educational purposes after a new school opened and the Pamunkey Baptist Association purchased the building for a recreation center for senior citizens. Now, my grandfather being born in 1921, by the time that school increased grades in 1946, he would have been 25 years old, which means Granddaddy Reuben was already out of school. He only went to school from 1st to 9th grade, is what that means. Uncle Willie would have been 21 years old. He would have been out of school. So that's what he told me. He said, school was only 1st through 9th grade. That's what you got. But we had great teachers. Our teachers were from Hampton Institute. And if you knew about Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, that was amazing to be in a rural area, a country school basically. And what also is amazing is that $7,900 that was raised by Black families to fund this school. That also is pretty remarkable. That speaks to the faith community. That speaks to Grandma Betties of the world who went up to New York City. The Rosenwald Foundation also, let's give them some credit, because many of the foundations such as that came from the Northeast. So Grandma Betty's of the world going to the Northeast, that builds relationships. Even though she may have not gone lobbying for money, that's representation. They knew she went home every summer to take care of her family and her children. That's what she could offer her children: an education, family, community, love, financial support. And it all goes back to love. Their commitment to education was so strong, my grandfather and his siblings, that they walked from the Pauls section of King William County, which was right on the Pamunkey River, to a major highway, which was closer to the King and Queen line in King William County, near Walkerton, but it was the King William section, so it was a long walk, and they walked through the snow. If you know Virginia weather on the eastern part of the state and near the Richmond area, central Virginia, winters are cold and ice storms and snow. They had boots, they walked, and sometimes you only had one pair of shoes. These are the stories that my grandfather passed down to my dad. In addition to love and community, Grandma Bettie was able to teach her children self-reliance, determination, and hard work ethics through her very actions and sacrifice of going to New York. These are the virtues I was talking about that cannot always be passed down orally through verbal communication. These are action-oriented through nonverbal communication. Through her very actions, she demonstrated and showed her children what it took and takes to make it in the world. That was love. And the next time that we come back for our next segment, we are going to talk about who I still believe was the love of her life, because they remained married for all of her life, almost until about 2 months before her passing.